This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
When a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He'd just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sprocky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door, run down to cell one, and get a bugler can full of Sprocky and take it back to his cells.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Welcome back, folks, to Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the men and women who work, lived, and served time here at the site. I'm in the trenches right now, and I'm joined with my co-host, Anthony.
Hello.
And we're also joined by a very special guest right now, and that is Eric Overzet.
Hello, everyone.
How are you both doing today?
Wonderful. How was your weekend?
Good. It was cold. We're having a little bit of a cold snap right now in Boise.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's super chilly, but I'm loving it.
Yeah.
Wish there's more snow. But,
yeah.
Great to have a special guest for this Stool Pigeon Saturday.
You.
Many of you who visit the site in this last year have probably met Eric at our front desk. He is one of our newest full-time staff members here at the site, and he actually did a captivating conversation last year about our topic today, about the quarry. So can we just start, Eric? Can you kind of introduce yourself? How long you've been working here at the Old Pen?
Sure. So I'm Eric Overzet. I've been here for about 4 years. I've put about the last year or so into the quarry a lot. I'm also working on a master's degree down in Boise State and using the quarry stone as my subject. So studying it in a lot of different directions all at the same time.
So wait a minute, is your capstone, your keystone, the quarry stone?
Absolutely, it is. Yep. It was used as a capstone many times. May as well one more, you know.
I love that. This idea rocks.
Oh,
I had to get this one out of the way right off the bat.
It had to happen, so may as well.
Nice. Well, Eric, what can you tell us about the quarry?
Well, the story kind of starts in the 1860s when Pinckney Luganbiel set off from Fort Vancouver towards the Boise area. He knew very little about the long geological history of the area. Him and his expedition set off from Walla Walla, Washington. His mission was to build a fort here in the Boise Valley to protect miners from Native American attacks in the Civil War era, but also to ensure that gold recently found up in the Boise Basin went to the Union war effort rather than down to the Confederacy. Upon his arrival, he found a surprising building material, silicified sandstone, a material usually found near coastal shores. He, along with Charles May, an Englishman skilled in masonry, began utilizing the sandstone he found a few miles from Boise. Beginning a silicified sandstone, it provided an extremely reliable and weatherable building material. By June 28, 1863, only 4 days after the Battle at Gettysburg would begin, Major Pinckney Luganbiel arrived at the site of what would be the future Fort Boise. Along the way, he stopped in Walla Walla and admired the first brick building in the city. It had been built by Charles May, who Luganbiel encouraged to come along with him. He and 3 detachments arrived and began the selection process of the exact location of the fort. By July 6th, Pinckney had picked the site for Fort Boise, as well as setting aside an area for wood and hay reserves. He also found the huge resource area, Boise Sandstone.
Our city would not be the same without this.
First buildings built here in Boise were now the VA, but that was the original Fort Boise, absolutely. And that's what created protection for settlers here, in my opinion. Boise was nothing in 1862. By 1865, it was one of the bigger, if not becoming the biggest city in Idaho already. So that protection spread real fast.
Yeah.
Part of it, too, is settlers only had really 3 choices of where to get supplies from. Originally, up north in northern Idaho, they got it mostly from Portland area. In the south, they got most of it from Utah, Salt Lake City area. Boise is much, much closer to either one, meaning it costs a lot less to supply yourself to do all those gold digs up there. So.
Yeah.
The sandstone actually has a really long geological history, nearly 100 million years prior to the excursion that Pinckney Luganbiel set off on. The Boise area was actually located on the western coast of Native America, where California is now. Over millions of years, the Pacific Plate subducted the North American Plate, causing it to rise and cool, and the granitic North American Plate began to rise and cool, creating the Idaho batholith, a large area of granite in the center of Idaho. By 12 million years ago, the Boise River Valley had begun as a rift, a low area that caught water over time between the Owyhee Mountains and the Boise Front. Throughout time, the water collected and collected. Somewhere around 9 to 2 million years ago, Lake Idaho began collecting. At its fullest point, the lake was believed to be about 200 miles long, 35 miles wide, and 3,800 feet deep. The weight of such a massive amount of water is what created the pressure that creates the sand into sandstone. It also caused a lot of fossilization. As early as 1871, fossils of fish were found in the sandstone up at Table Rock, forcing early Boiseans to question what might have happened to have underwater life at such a high elevation. Although the lake's original drainage system was likely to the south, geologists theorized that the melting glaciers caused the lake to spill over its natural boundaries somewhere between 2 and 4 million years ago and forced the drainage to the northwest, gouging out what is today Hell's Canyon, the deepest canyon in North America. As the water ran the west side of the Rocky Mountains, the Boise River cut a valley through the area while spontaneously depositing silt in all the different levels of the floodplains. This creates the 8 terraces of the Boise area today and explains why fossils of fish were found at such a high elevation.
So you've got pressure from the water.
Correct, the weight.
And then is there heat underneath that?
It's not so much heat, but the hot water is stirring up silicates. They're generally coming from old life that is kind of just cycling around in the sand, but is boiling up into it and creating it to act chemically like a cementing agent. Is what it does. So makes it anywhere between 1.5 to 2 times as heavy and about 2 to 3 times as durable.
Wow. So that geothermal water that we get, Warm Springs Avenue, Old Kelly Hot Springs, which was kind of near Table Rock, near the quarry area.
Absolutely.
That geothermal has silicate, which is made of, like you said, like animals, like
discarded animals, old, millions of years old.
Yeah,
microbes that have broken down. In some cases, it doesn't become things like oil; it just breaks into silicates.
Yeah,
and that underwater life was what created all of the silicates that boil up into it.
And that, paired with the sand, creates this very dense, unique sandstone that we have here.
That I know of. It only happens 5 places in the world.
Wow.
The next closest is called Berea. That's southern Michigan, northern Ohio area. There's one in Africa, one in India, and one in Russia, kind of northern Russia somewhere.
Wow. Very cool.
But very, very rare stuff.
Yeah.
And this is by far and away the most silicated. So it's the most durable. It's the heaviest. It's the most by far and away in the world that we've found.
I just love this ancient prehistory surrounds us. Our walls are made of this.
Absolutely.
All of this went into creating the sandstone, which is still standing so well. And it, despite fires, the dining hall and the chapel can still stand because of this stone. It's
absolutely. That stone
powerful.
Refuses to burn no matter what you do to it, right?
That's very cool. Oh, sorry. I'll keep going.
So the geothermal water is actually what I was going to talk about next. It was a really large factor, but it was a really large factor here in Boise as well. It's been used several times. In 1890, 3 investors began digging up a well looking for a source of artesian hot water. The wealthiest of the 3 investors, C.W. Moore, a very, very prominent man here in Boise, built his home on Warm Springs Avenue in 1892 and became the very first in the United States to heat his own house with the geothermal water. They began digging, and in December of 1890 and by January 1891, they had actually reached a depth of 404 feet and found what they called a tremendous flow of water at 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Shortly after, a second well was dug right next to it, 404 feet deep as well. And the two together in 1891 put out 800,000 gallons of hot water a day. It was cycled back into itself to reheat itself because it put out so much water. They were actually concerned it would get rid of all of its water in a matter of a few years. So they actually had to put a return back in, to put water back into it as well. Soon after, several of the homes in the area up and down Warm Springs were hooked to the geothermal water. One of the good reasons, coal heat was the other option here in Idaho at the time. It was about 3 times as expensive, and you had to buy it, you had to haul it yourself, you had to load it in the stove yourself, whereas the geothermal basically just took care of all of itself. I like to tell a lot of our guests here that that's one of the reasons that there are so many large houses. On the way out to the penitentiary, I looked it up, and in 1900, it was $2 for what they called a normal house to heat your house a year. That would be anything 5 rooms or less. A house that had 5 or more rooms was $3. Coal heat was around $8 to $9 for a normal size house, so it was easily a third of the price.
Wow.
But by far and away the largest endeavor that the Boise Hot and Cold Water Company took on was the natatorium. In May of 1892, the doors opened to a 15,000 square foot building, opened to a 65-foot by 125-foot pool, kept at 98 degrees Fahrenheit, known to the locals as just the Nat. The facility housed a dining room, tea room, saloon, club rooms, gymnasium, baths, dance floor that covered the actual pool itself, and even card rooms. It was built in a Moorish revival style that varied greatly from the more Queen Anne gingerbread style that was popular in the time, and especially in the area. For the cost of $87,000, the Nat boasted 2 6-story towers at the entrance, an artificial waterfall overlooking a lava rock diving platform, a 2-story copper slide, and a dining room, club room, a saloon, gymnasium, dance floors, and trusses that spanned the ceiling, and the mezzanine ran all the way around the pool. A trolley built by the Boise Rapid Transit Company ran down Warm Springs at the cost of a nickel to ride by 1907. Also in 1907, the White City Amusement Park took up next door. They offered dance pavilions, boating docks, penny arcades, and a roller skating rink. It became such a portion of Boise and even Idaho culture that the first inaugural Governor's Ball actually took place there in 1901. The geothermal water had effects other places as well. By 1934, unfortunately for the Nat, the wooden trusses had begun to rot out. The hot water and the silicates also penetrate the wood and cause it to rot much, much quicker. With the ongoing Great Depression, plans to repair the Nat were put in place, but never were actually taken in consideration. 1934 was the same year that a windstorm blew the roof down into the pool. There were actually people in the pool when it blew down. Fortunately, no one was hurt. Everyone had pushed to the sides. They heard the creaking and cracking and pushed to the sides. It fell right into the dead center of the pool. Within a few months, a project to get rid of the Nat was taken over, and now that's the area that is Adams Elementary. They actually have the natatorium is a little swimming area out back still to this day. So it has a little bit of an homage, but nothing like it was originally, that's for sure.
If there's one place I could go to, I would love to get a drink at the natatorium.
Oh, totally. It's like the one few places where I get like historian FOMO.
Yeah.
Where I look at photos, photos of the Nat, and I hear about these amazing balls that they're having. And I would spend all day. I'd start my morning in a good soak, and then, have a nice lunch there, and then dance, dance the night away, have
there
some
was
drinks.
A famous New Yorker that came and visited the Nat, and shortly thereafter started calling Boise the jewel of the desert.
Oh, yeah.
Because everything he saw around the area was desert, but it was a jewel in the center of the desert. And his big moment was the Nat here in Boise, about 1910.
So cool. I love the view, though, too, of Patrick Murphy, who wrote Behind Gray Walls. And he's strolling up Warm Springs Avenue, and he sees this kind of Gothic-looking building in the middle of nowhere, this massive structure. and he sees the natatorium. He's like, oh, wow, that looks scary. And then they drive right past it, and they come up the drive to the old pen, and then he sees the walls, and he's like, okay, this is more like it.
And because the architecture is so different from the Queen Anne style that happens all up and down Warm Springs, I'm sure it was a very big shock for him to see this huge Gothic building out of nowhere, right?
It's so cool.
Well, and what you'd think is to be incarcerated and be able to see that in the distance.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
Jeez.
One of the escapes, a gentleman hid behind there for about 2 hours before he winds up getting caught, right? So it was a prominent feature here in Boise and huge in a lot of ways. The paper talks about it was actually hard to cut down to this small amount. The paper talks about the natatorium constantly in the 30-ish years it's around. So,
isn't the legend that after Diamondfield Jack got released, the first thing he did was get a glass of whiskey at the natatorium before it took off?
So cool.
Obviously, the area doesn't start with the building and the settling. One of the things I also had to do a lot of research on was Native Americans in Table Rock as well. Yeah. As early as 14,500 years ago, archaeological records show native hunter-gatherer tribes in the Boise River Valley. In 1893, while residents of the Idaho Old Penitentiary were quarrying the sandstone at Table Rock, they discovered, quote, a number of human bones supposed to have belonged to the noble Red Man. By 1862, gold was found in the Boise Basin. In January of 63, the new fort along the Oregon Trail definitely changed what Native Americans saw in the Boise Valley. With ongoing hostilities between the United States and Native tribes in the area, by October of 1864, the Treaty of Fort Boise had been agreed on. It forced Boise Shoshone to give up all claims to any land in the Boise Valley, as well as the Boise Basin, for an undetermined sum of money and equal to access to fisheries. They were supposed to be given money as a sum, but also food, clothing, and other random goods. Unfortunately for the Shoshone, the treaty was actually never ratified by the United States government. Although they never legally gave up the rights to the Boise Valley, the treaty saw most Native Americans leave the Boise Valley, but generally remained just outside the 30-mile area that the treaty had actually defined. While the Shoshone held up their end of the treaty, the hardest part, never having been ratified, the United States government has never paid anything to the Nez Perce people, nor the Shoshone, nor the Paiutes, nor any group in the area for the Boise Valley. The story of Fort Boise and the city of Boise itself are actually intertwined in several ways to the Civil War. After years of continued attacks by Native Americans as early as October of 1860, General George Wright, commander of the Oregon Department of the National Army, formally requested the United States Army to construct a replacement for Fort Boise. Unfortunately for Westerners clamoring for the fort, before any actions could be taken, the start of the Civil War took priority. By 1862, General Wright had taken command of the entire Pacific Coast District. In October, 2 years after the official request, the new commander of the Oregon Department of the National Army, General Benjamin Alvord, sent him a letter pleading for the fort and saying that with gold being found since the original request was ignored, the need had grown tenfold. Despite General Wright's complete agreement with Alvord, no word for a month, Alvord finally wrote again on the 23rd of December, saying, "The great necessity for a strong garrison in the quarter is daily becoming more apparent. In the very heart of the mining districts of the north, and en route by which the vast emigration from the east approaches that country, a strong military force can afford protection to all against those wandering bands of Indians which infest that section and maintain peace between the two races." With the governor from Washington's endorsement, on January 14, 1863, Fort Boise was authorized by the Secretary of War. By June 28, 1863, 4 days before the battle at Gettysburg, Major Pinckney Luganville arrived in the Boise area. He was accompanied by 3 companies of infantry and 1 of cavalry, along with some engineers and artisans. Along the way, he had stopped in Walla Walla, admired the first building, and took along with him Charles May, the designer of the territorial prison here in Idaho Old Penitentiary. He and 3 of the detachments arrived and began selection process for the exact location of the fort. By July 6th, Pinckney had picked the fort site as well as wood, hay reserves, and started roads around. By the 7th and 8th, he had actually sat down with an entire group of settlers and laid out most of the Boise area in downtown. After surveying the site for almost a week, the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg had happened, and Pinckney declared the location for the fort, but his troubles had just really begun. No infrastructure in the area also meant that he was tasked with creating the means to make all of his own building supplies, roads, and everything to get those building supplies from point A to point B. He also found a limestone kiln, the first quarry on top of Table Rock. He not only lacked materials, he engaged in the roads with just what infantry he had. They had very little idea of what they were actually doing, building the roads. So the original roads were kind of just sand and river rock thrown down to be good enough for vehicles to move across.
Yeah.
The building at the Quartermasters was finished in actually 1863. It's the first building that we know of made of the sandstone itself. Within a year or two, it was actually accompanied by 6 more stone buildings and surrounded by a fence, leaving a parade area in the original very center of everything. And that's the area that all of Boise grew up around originally. The fort was constructed to obviously defend the miners, but it also served as a Civil War fort. There were a lot of hostilities in the Midwest, so a lot of the Boise area was shoved over to areas like Kansas and things like that during the Civil War. By 1912, it had been renamed the Boise Barracks, and it was handed over to the National Guard in 1919. In 1938, it was actually given to the VA and actually still belongs to them to this day. They actually still use all those buildings as the VA to this day. So, I think that's really cool that they can still use those historic buildings.
Yeah.
As far as the penitentiary starts in many ways in 1866, in my opinion. A local newspaper ran an article proposing the idea that the sandstone could be used to make a secure jail. The local newspaper, the Idaho Statesman, ran the article in 1870 letting locals know already that the area had been claimed by the government and that it was already being quarried and used for the territorial prison. They actually found, shortly after they declared it belonging to the Idaho state government, a person living out right on top of the quarry. Fortunately for them, he was kind of a squatter, and they made a deal with him, and he left within a short period of time. So it kind of opened up that whole area.
Was it a monetary deal?
It was. It was a semi-monetary deal, but also they gave him an area down where one of the parks would be today, about Ann Morrison. Yeah. He actually owned a small area down in Ann Morrison Park for a short period of time. So. Nice. And sold it off later for actually more money. So
good for him.
Yeah. The quarrying really ramped up in the 1890s, though. The 1890 cell house was completed in 1889, but it took several years. The wall and the 2-house and 3-house were the largest amount of up there. We don't have a lot of warden's reports from the 1880s, 1890s about what was quarried, but by about 1894 is when we finally start catching the first reports. 1890 is the first report where they show the idea of the quarry, but they talk about the labor problem up there. One of the problems they ran into in the 1890s, it was both being used as free labor and as prison labor here at the same time. And local free laborers were not very happy to be working next to the prisoners. Yeah. So they actually decided to throw a strike in 1892. They lasted only a couple of months before they kind of broke it. The way they broke it is that they actually stopped all quarrying through the penitentiary for a short period of time. And then the state started to realize they had a quarry that the quarriers, the free laborers, couldn't quite see as well. So the state actually did reopen it up, but just in a different location where it was a little farther apart. They weren't working quite so close hand in hand together. Yeah. The warden's report of 1894 is where it really starts to show. Inmates 20 to 30, give or take, were working up in the quarry, and another 15 or 20 were here inside the walls, cutting and shaping the stone throughout the year. By December, the penitentiary reached a depth of 112 feet with their own geothermal water, and it ran at about 112 degrees Fahrenheit. So they not only chose to use the stone, as we generally know around here, they actually dug their own wells and used that hot water as the only source of heat and electricity around here for decades and decades as well. It didn't take long after they stopped quarrying to start resuming again. Warden Campbell reports that the 20 to 30 employed in the quarry have been up there for over the last year and have taken out all the rock used in the walls and buildings over the last year. Simultaneously, from 15 to 25 measured an enclosed area of about 4 acres with the wall. So 15 to 25 working still to finish off the wall in 1894, working with the sandstone, cutting it, mortaring it, all of that stuff. The wall winds up being 480 foot long from north to south and 360 feet long from east to west, 17 foot high, including a coping about 28 inches total thick. So a lot of sandstone went into that wall.
How many blocks are there?
No idea. I know that in 1890, so 3 years before they started the wall, there are sources that talk about them quarrying up there. There is no building between the 1890s cell house really in that wall, so it probably took them most of 3 to 4 years of quarrying while they were building for about 2 of those. So huge amount of labor.
Like how many hundreds of pounds of sandstone? Like thousands.
I would say hundreds of tons of sandstone in that wall.
And the
they dropped anywhere
too.
between 4 and 8 foot deep underneath as well to keep people from going underneath. So there's a lot of sandstone in that wall.
Yeah.
A lot.
That's amazing.
By 1898, the dining hall started to accompany the list of sandstone buildings here at the penitentiary. This magnificent building had a resident here as an architect, George Hamilton, who we've talked about in the past. To increase usable area for the penitentiary, he actually had dug out the entire basement for 6 large rooms up underneath. He had it trenched all the way around to let natural light in before electricity was there. They originally contained a cellar, a shoe shop, a butcher shop, bakery, laundry, and bathrooms down underneath. On top, the building was capable of housing 50 foot by 4 inch by 49 and 8 inch dining hall that could accommodate upwards of 300 people at a time and use the last 25 feet squared as the kitchen and a guard access. The false fronts shortly thereafter were also added on as stone buildings around here. After the turn of the century, the 2 more cell houses made of sandstone were added. In 1899, 2 and 3 houses were both referred to as the 1899 cell house, but shortly after were split into the 2. Construction of the 2, 183 by 40 feet, lasted upwards of 25 years for 3 house. The last one of the 2 completed was not actually completed until 1928, and that actually ends the sandstone era around here. By the 1920s, the penitentiary had turned to concrete. The building material used much after the sandstone. 23, the real death would be the shirt factory. The fact that it was put up in a matter of months rather than some of the cell houses that took decades to actually complete made it very obvious that the labor was much more utilizable in concrete. Outside of the walls, between 1900 and 1920, 3 more sandstone buildings were added. The warden's house, the guard's house, and the women's ward were all built alongside the penitentiary throughout the years. Biggest one here in Boise by far and away has to be the Capitol building. The Idaho Capitol building was built mostly out of Boise sandstone. The story of the Capitol at Boise starts soon after the founding of the city. On March 4th, 1863, Idaho was admitted as a territory, and Idaho's first territorial capital was picked, Lewiston, representing a growing population in the northern area of the state. The gold rush at Pierce in 1861 brought settlers en masse to the area, and Lewiston boomed. It had access to communication and transportation advantages, being located on both the Clearwater and Snake Rivers, tributaries to the Columbia. A single-story wooden building was built prior to 1862, and that acted as the first territorial capital. One of the other big advantages of Lewiston, the only port in Idaho. It actually reaches all the way out to the Pacific, so it had the ability to move ships all the way into Lewiston, right near the gold up in the north.
The most inland seaport in the country.
Absolutely.
Hard to even comprehend.
And a huge resource in the 1860s when land movement was so slow and sea movement was so fast in comparison.
Yeah.
By the summer of 1862, though, things were looking to change. Gold had been found in the Boise Basin. By September of 1863, the census already shows a higher population in Boise than Lewiston, and Boise was still growing. Boise had been found in 1863, so within the first year it was already passing Lewiston in population. The Northern Idahoans tried, when the second legislature in Idaho's history met, to break away from the Idaho Territory and join Eastern Washington, but it had all been too late. By the time the legislature session, Northern Idaho's population was only about 27,090, and Southern Idaho's population had reached close to 20,000. The Southern Idahoans not only kept Idaho whole, they also voted to move the territorial capital to Boise. The Northern Idahoans were furious, but ultimately Boise became the capital anyway. Although Boise was the site of the capital for the next 20 plus years, Boise was unable to make anything but makeshift buildings to house the territorial government. Finally, in 1885, the 13th territorial legislature approved a single building to become the territorial capital building. By 1886, a red brick structure between Jefferson State, 6th and 5th, was erected by a Detroit architect, Elijah E. Myers. Although the building worked far better than the amalgamation of different buildings downtown, an old outhouse sitting next to it harkened back to Boise's frontier days.
Was that their actual restroom? Or
Yes, it was a working outhouse. They used it all the way into the 20th century. It was a boast of Boiseers that they had an outhouse in the 20th century for a while. So a single building was obviously needed, but finally, with the concept and budget for a true new building, a location was purchased, a plot of land to the west of the territorial capital building for about $25,000, and they began looking for an architect. In March of 1905, the local paper ran an article inviting architects to an open contest for the best design. A Connecticut-born Tortolot was not formally trained but did show up for the original. He did not win, but he did attempt to build the original territorial prison. He had one small piece of paper involved, whereas many architects had 3 or 4 designs that they had turned in by this point. With the architect in hand, they finally started quarrying the sandstone for the building. In October of 1906, the Capitol Commission approved the purchase of parts of the Table Rock Quarry from the Jellison brothers for a sum of about $20,000. The state purchased a quarry containing the stone described in the local paper by Judge Beatty as the stone in this quarry is of unusually fine quality. It excels in both texture and coloring of the stone. John Jellison proceeded to state, these quarries contain about all the great cunning stone in Idaho, and the part of our quarry we sold contains enough stone to build 10 cities like New York in it. We were actually able to talk to the gentleman that owns the place today, and they recently did ground penetrating radar. He about doubled that when he talked about it this last year. So the amount of stone up there is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
He said that even with all the buildings we've ever built, probably about 5 to 6% is all we've ever used.
Unbelievable amount of stone up there.
It's huge.
I was blown away.
That
was like how many years do you think you have? I think was the question. He's just like, he kind of laughed. And,
He had that look like how many centuries, what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How many generations?
Absolutely.
Can we use the sandstone? Yeah.
It's ridiculous how much is up there still. The unfortunate part is that it's very difficult to build with, being as heavy as it is, even moving it around. They were laughing and kidding with us that some of the largest machinery I've ever seen in my life, they oftentimes have to play what he called soccer with it. That's where they take one that's too large to pick up and they kind of just kick it down the hill until they get it close enough to roll it up on something. So the machine can't actually pick it up. He said the weight limit on the machine he was using was around 20 tons, so about 40,000 pounds. The rock he was kicking was about 50 to 60,000 pounds. So they're massive. It's hard to even explain how big they are.
Yeah.
And what would that have been like before the machines? Back when you were hand carving this and using dynamite, like, whew.
Well, that's the next thing I'm working on talking about is some of the dangers of quarrying.
Let's get to it.
I've just decided to pick out a couple of stories that really do tell it, one of which I couldn't avoid doing, William Bedell. William entered the Idaho Old Penitentiary on September 24th, 1889 for murder in the second degree. According to the Idaho Statesman, Bedell had shot and killed Frederick Hine, Dutch Fred as he was known here in the Boise area. Hine, a resident of the Boise area and former city marshal, had actually kicked in a locked door to the house that Bedell was in. Though Bedell had tried to fight it in court, the fight ensued between the two of them, and Bedell wound up shooting Hine in the stomach, which killed him. In 1901, 12 years after he entered the penitentiary, he was finally paroled. Bedell had spent 12 years quarrying. That was his job the entire time here, and he was released because he was, quote, withered, harmless, inoffensive, and prematurely old man. He was released to a former warden where he actually lived out the rest of his life. But they did actually take a moment towards the end of the article to make sure that everyone understood that in 1889, when Bedell had entered the penitentiary, he was, quote, a strong, hearty, robust young man. So in a matter of 12 years of working in the quarry, he had not only hurt his back, he had, according to some of the things I read, a very hard time standing up straight. He had a very curved back from picking up way too heavy of weight over and over again. He had just kind of destroyed himself, and they released him because he was so badly hurt while he was here. Not by any one incident, but by lifting that heavy rock over and over for 12 years. So.
Hard labor.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Very hard labor and very heavy stone in this case. So
the use of hard labor as a punishment. You're incarcerated at the old Idaho Penitentiary for a term of hard labor. Like, it was a lot of suffering.
Absolutely. The other two at the penitentiary, John Stewart and William Maney. These two were, in May of 1903, two of the residents from the Idaho Old Penitentiary were working with a blasting crew. A blast intended to split across a seam of a boulder failed to split the boulder. The boulder measured 10 feet high and 25 feet square. After it failed to split, Stewart and Maney climbed up to the boulder to clear the rock fragment away and prepare to re-blast. As they neared the top, the boulder gave way and rolled down the hill. Neither one could get out of the way. Both men were killed on the spot.
Were they thrown from it?
They were, according to the paper, thrown into eternity. They were both killed instantly. The private sector was not a ton better. William Marks in 1905. Same kind of deal. They had blown a boulder up on top of Table Rock, and he went up to check it out, but as he started to walk up the hill, the boulder gave. He tried to move out of the way. Unfortunately for him, 2 tons of rock came to rest on the portion of his abdomen. He was caught by the limbs, as he had put it. Although he was pulled from underneath the 2-ton stone, the internal injuries that happened and broken femur that they noted at the local hospital managed to make sure that he did eventually pass away the next day from his injuries. He's actually still buried up at the Morris Hill Cemetery. The hardest part for me with the William Marks is that he actually has statements that he made after the boulder hit him. So he was actually conscious for probably about 15 to 20 minutes after it hit him until the shock finally kicked in and knocked him unconscious. So that sounded absolutely horrible to me. Like,
That is brutal.
yeah. And he was just from the private sector, so just working a job. One of the things that I found fascinating was not only the statesman's willingness to talk about the Table Rock Quarry, but quarries in general. Around about the same time that William Marks was killed in the private sector, there was actually a article that was run. Although the Statesman always loves to run their articles their way, it was definitely an Irishman working in a quarry. And it was talking about how he's walking down at the bottom of the quarry and his boss was up at the top of the quarry. And he was kind of talking to himself, wondering why, if his boss had stepped on a rock that came down and killed him, he'd be at fault for not watching out. Because that's a lot how work laws worked at the time. It was basically on you to be watching out for yourself and everything. It was not the employer's job to take care of you or watch out for you in any way. So it was a long article about all of the injustices in a lot of the mining, but quarrying specifically, that happened here in Idaho. It was definitely considered a second-class job by most. So finally, I just kind of wanted to talk about the quarry today. As Anthony was talking about, we got the fun of going up there last year and seeing them do all kinds of stuff, splitting the stone, loading the stone. They actually even gave us a really good clip of an explosion they had done the year before to knock all the stone they were cutting up at the time. It was fascinating, but the area is still all owned by the State Historical Society, and a really big portion of Table Rocks is obviously the trails up to it. So to this day, a lot of that quarry is still active, although Boise sandstone is rarely used as a building material. It makes great landscaping. He said that he had sold it to 36 states and 17 countries since he had taken over in a few years. Wow. So in a matter of 3 years, it had literally traveled around the world. The hiking trails that lead up to Table Rock are actually the most popular here in the Boise area, according to a couple of local websites, Boise Trails in particular. The 3.2 mile loop is the one that most people do, but a 3.7 mile loop will actually put you up on top of Table Rock, walk you all the way around the quarry, back onto Table Rock, and right back down. So it's only about an extra half mile to walk around the rim of the quarry and look down in.
But it's worth it.
Absolutely, it is.
I love Table Rock. I love Boise. So cool.
Absolutely. Well, and it's a cool city. It really is run still to this day. One of the other things I found with the geothermal water, about 3 million square feet in Boise is actually run, business area, is run still to this day on that geothermal. So they still use it for heat all over the Capitol building, local high school, all kinds of stuff. So
such an incredible resource that I don't think a lot of people are super aware of. It would be amazing if someday we got it into every home, and we were all heated with this geothermal.
I think the part that really set me off was realizing how much of it comes out. 800,000 gallons of hot water a day. Incredible. It's ridiculous how much it comes out.
A future dream is to have a geothermal pool here at the old pen, on site somewhere.
100% in.
A natatorium 2.0.
Have your cold pool next to it.
Yeah.
Let's fill the walls.
That's why, the dining hall, there's a big moat. I mean, obvious.
It's already dug out. I say go for it.
Yeah, if any investors are listening.
Please let us know.
Yeah, well, that was great, Eric.
Good.
I love hearing about the sandstone. What countries surprised you that the sandstone went to?
So I think the one that surprised me the most was Japan.
Japan, wow.
Yes. They actually ordered some back in the 1940s as a facade for one of the buildings in Tokyo. I would say the one that's built out of it that's the most would be Harkness Tower over on Yale. On their actual campus. So, and that tower is actually built solidly out of sandstone. They used wood on the inside to brace it, but it's solid sandstone from top to bottom. So,
man, that's what I loved doing this podcast, learning about the old pen, how many weird connections we have with the Sandstone to Yale, what?
Right.
To Tokyo? That's such a fun,
Absolutely.
wild thing to learn and to connect to this old prison.
I think because
So
the
cool.
Japanese have so much geothermal in their area as well, that it kind of brings the idea that sandstone makes it look like something Japanese. It's really cool looking.
With a lot of these early frontier towns and boom towns, the woods buildings just don't hold up. And
Right.
so the fact that we have so many incredible buildings that have lasted the test of time and are probably going to last a lot longer are stone barns. I often get comments like there are very few barns in the United States built in, the turn of the century that are made of sandstone. That's incredible.
Well, and sandstone's a terrible building material if
Yeah.
it's not solidificated. It weathers so very fast.
Yeah,
This is a
totally,
very
totally.
rare version of it. And like I say, it doesn't happen for thousands of miles in any direction other than here. So.
Well, and guests often are like, oh, if it's made of sandstone, couldn't they crumble it easily? And it's like, whoa. Let's talk about the sandstone for a minute.
Right. Very, very different sandstone.
Yeah.
They call it a cementing process when it's being pushed, but it took anywhere between 5 and 6 million years of that pressure on top and the geothermal underneath to actually create that large area of sandstone. So it takes a long time to build as well.
Yeah. The next time I'm up on Table Rock, I'm just going to imagine I'm on the beach, looking out across Lake Idaho to the Waihees, the other side of the beach. And
Absolutely.
Oh, man. I love that.
I mean, only about 9 million years off. You're pretty close.
Yeah.
That was the West Coast, right? So.
That's very cool. All right. Well, you have anything else you want to
No, I think that's about it. Thank you guys.
Yeah, great job, Eric. That's
Good, thank
fascinating.
you.
Obviously, you've put in a tremendous amount of work. You've done a lot of digging into this, and it shows.
Second
It shows.
joke. I like it.
You really put together an awesome project.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I had a blast.
Good.
Sorry about this. Eric, all right.
All right.
If I were to say do your own time, how would you respond to that?
We'll do your own number.
I love it. Hey, you're wearing a Behind Gray Walls shirt.
Of course.
Wow, available
Available
in
on the
our
gift
gift
shop.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
We'll talk to you all soon.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Not only do we get to hear your feedback about the show, but it helps others find us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the podcast and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, follow our Facebook group at Behind Gray Walls Podcast. And we have a podcast Instagram as well. You can find us on Instagram at Behind Gray Walls Pod.